Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Thesis Theater. My name is Dr. Brenton Dickieson, and I teach in the Language and Literature Department at Signum University. Our Signum Master's students have the opportunity to write a thesis at the end of their degree program, and they can explore a topic of their choice related to or coming out of the material they've studied in the previous years. And these thesis theaters are really a great opportunity for students to present research, but not just in the academic form of the final big honkin' paper that they produce, that we are pleased to make them produce, but also to a more general audience in a conversational and presentation form. This also allows them to tease out some of the implications of their work and answer questions from the audience, from you great folks. Now, I love these events, and so I'm just really pleased to be here hosting Miriam Davidson, also pleased as her supervisor to see this project come to this point. And today we're going to be talking about the sword, not for its sharpness, nonviolent countercurrents in Tolkien's Epic of War. Now, I'm going to introduce Miriam in a moment, but I want to give a couple of notes about our Zoom live stream event today, this Thesis Theater, and some of the etiquette and protocol for that. This session's being recorded, so just be aware of that, and will be part of Signum's YouTube channel when it's all finished and goes up in a couple of days. And this is also not just part of Signum's digital profile, but Miriam's contributing to Signum's Library of Knowledge, which we love about these master's theses. Miriam will present for about 15-20 minutes or so at the beginning of the session, followed by questions and answers. Probably I'll tease up a few questions and then turn to you, the audience. And we would love for you to ask questions. This is like why it's here. And to do this, we would love for you to use the question and answer feature rather than the chat. We suspect that the chat will be kind of a nice conversational thing with greetings already from Gabriel, who's here helping us host, but also a kind of people that have queries or thoughts or want to tease it out. That tends to be the chat. That makes it a little hard for me as the moderator of the questions to make sure I've gotten everybody. So use the question feature for the formal questions, and if you'd like to speak them out, just notify us of that in that question to say I'll speak on my mic. And we love hearing those voices, but I can interpret the question for Miriam. So I think now it's time to turn to the main show. We've got Miriam Davidson here. She has been practicing She has been practicing as a forensic psychiatric nurse practitioner in the Department of Corrections for the past 15 years. She has a deep-rooted love for fantasy literature and has pursued this MA degree to expand and strengthen her reading and writing skills. With the help of her husband and dogs, she spends her free time restoring a 200-year-old lighthouse in Down East, Maine. So Miriam is going to be presenting on her thesis, The Sword Not for Its Sharpness, Nonviolent Countercurrents in Tolkien's Epic of War. Why don't you go ahead, Miriam? Thanks for coming.
Nice. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah, it looks great and you sound great.
Okay, good. All right. So thank you for coming, everybody. I will try to get through this. So J.R.R. Tolkien served in the British Army on the front lines during World War I and the Battle of the Somme in France in 1960. The Battle of the Somme lasted nearly 5 months, claiming the lives of over 1 million soldiers, including nearly 20,000 British soldiers on the first day of combat, and was recorded as the worst day in British warfare. Tolkien suffered for months in the trenches, surrounded by mortar and machine gun fire. He felt firsthand the intensity of killing fellow men with whom he had no personal quarrel. Millions of Europeans, including 2 of Tolkien's closest friends, nearly half of his enlisted schoolmates, and most of his battalion were dead by the time the war came to an end in 1918. Tolkien's direct involvement in World War I with the British Army laid the foundation for his realistic appreciation of war's moral ambiguity and left him with no doubt about its horrors. The applicability and impact of Tolkien's works in my own life are the foundation for my interest in the violent and nonviolent tensions found in The Lord of the Rings. When I first opened the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien enchanted me with his world. Rivendell, nestled deep in the hidden chasm, and fair Lothlorien climbing upwards with ancient trees and elves. Most of all, it was the characters who captured my heart. Wise Gandalf, steadfast Aragorn, loyal Sam, and most of all, martyr Frodo, who saved Middle-earth by sacrificing himself for others. Each time I return to reread The Lord of the Rings, the war and conflict permeating Tolkien's mythology brings rushing forward my deep-rooted and long-standing views on the aptness of nonviolent resistance under any circumstance. My non-fictional heroes have long been the likes of Gandhi and his reflective defiance, and Martin Luther King with his powerful voice and guidance reverberating through a divided country. As much as I wanted to add Tolkien to this list of powerful advocates for the effectiveness on nonviolent techniques, it is clear that Tolkien's representation of violent conflict delve into the no man's land located at the overlapping point where forceful and peaceful action meet. The sparing of Gollum, Wormtongue, and Saruman highlight these commanding messages of compassion and restraint, yet the desperate, blood-stained, sacrificial fight of Boromir for the protection of others at the conclusion of the Fellowship of the Ring also carries powerful messages of love, compassion, and courage. Tolkien's Epic of War is as disturbed with countercurrents of nonviolence as my long-held belief in nonviolence is troubled by Tolkien's portrayal of war. Tolkien's creations reveal the reality that war is not to be sought, but neither can it be wished away with creative problem-solving, ideological hope, or sentimental beliefs. Tolkien's works demonstrate the terrible moral impasse that violence is highly destructive and should be avoided. Nevertheless, there are times when war is necessary. This tension is masterfully created by Tolkien, and although his works are not allegorical, there is a symbolic resemblance. The fairy story mode is a way of reflecting truth without the use of allegory or satire, and his works reflect truths of war that are consumed by each reader uniquely. As a reader, I find myself drawn to the nonviolent actions, and yet I begin to understand the truth that violent engagement has a potential to play a role in conflict resolution. Figure out how to advance the screen. Hang on one sec. Oh, there we go. All right. Tolkien's works spend considerable time exploring the tragic necessity of war while simultaneously showing the physical and mental devastation that war exacts from the earth and those who experience it. Considering Tolkien's war experiences, how should readers consider war and violence in The Lord of the Rings? Despite being a story about the Great War of the Ring, the main plot of The Lord of the Rings focuses on the largely nonviolent perseverance of Frodo and Sam to destroy the devastating weapon of the enemy. Sheer moral determination, rather than military arms, deposes Sauron's evil power. Yet there is no victory for Frodo and Sam without the armed power of Gondor to draw the eye of Sauron from the weary hobbits. Frodo and Sam's story highlight Tolkien's use of character and narrative to accentuate the courage and honor earned for those who sacrifice themselves in combat. His plot demands and often justifies violent action. The people of Middle-earth will not stand by as Sauron works to enslave and kill the free folk. Still, there is a clear and consistent emphasis on the cost and devastation these violent engagements bring. Tolkien's narrative strongly warns against the lust for power and the will to dominate others, while elevating the importance of grace, forgiveness, and not striking without the gravest of need. Discovering the tensions at play between the honor of war and its human devastation, I explored the countercurrents of nonviolence in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. These countercurrents ultimately demonstrate that Tolkien's representation of war and nonviolence is impacted by his literary mode, educational background, personal beliefs, and exposure to war. Historian John Garth describes the impact the war had on Tolkien. Personal loss was piled on top of the horror and exhaustion of battle. There was no counseling for bereavement or post-traumatic stress in the army. It was business as usual. Tolkien's company was sent to the front lines, and Humphrey Carpenter describes, corpses lay in every corner, horribly torn by the shells. Those that still had faces stared with dreadful eyes. Beyond the trenches, no man's land was littered with bloated and decaying bodies. All around was desolation. The horror of war surrounding Tolkien quickly driving out his youth and naivety. Tolkien fell victim to trench fever, and as described by Carpenter, in a matter of days, he found himself transported from the horror of the trenches to white sheets and a view of the city he knew so well. Tolkien spent the rest of the war in a hospital or in home service camps. The recovery process was slow and interrupted by many relapses. Garth describes Tolkien as feeling hungry, lonely, and powerless, and oppressed by the universal weariness of all this war. Although Tolkien's direct involvement with combat was 4 months long, he spent well over 2 years in and out of hospitals and facing the prospect of returning to the battlefield. These years were traumatic, impactful, and grueling on Tolkien. Garth argues that the foundation of Tolkien's tragic experience in the First World War is the key to Middle-earth's lasting power. Tolkien used his mythological imagination not to escape from the gut-wrenching realities of his circumstances, but to reflect, communicate, and transform his knowledge into something that could be widely consumed and explored. Reviewing his tragic experience in the First World War, it is heartbreakingly easy to see how each horrifying event contributed to Tolkien's strong convictions about war. The desire for careful exploration of war and its merits in his fiction would follow naturally, ultimately producing his complex stance on war throughout his works. One of the most apparent impacts of the war in Tolkien's fiction can be seen in battle descriptions in The Lord of the Rings. These carry a grim likeness of that of his wartime exposure. The persistent artillery bombardment, the scent of gas, and the bodies of dead soldiers littering the battlefield. In the Siege of Gondor and the Return of the King, evil orcs are, quote, digging lines of deep trenches in a huge ring, while others maneuver, quote, great engines for the casting of missiles. On the path to Mordor in the Two Towers, the air of the stronghold of Sauron is, quote, filled with a bitter reek that caught the breath and parched their mouths. Tolkien later acknowledged that the dead marshes were the pools of muck and floating corpses. That the dead marshes with their pools of muck and floating corpses, quote, owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme. The Somme illustrates the waste and futility of battle. It is easy to see how those taking part in the war would become disillusioned, not only with war, but also with the very idea of a courageous and honor-filled battle. Yet Tolkien ultimately departed from his contemporaries, preferring a different tone and returned to ideas of hope and the ability to resist evil. The heroism of Tolkien's characters, no matter their strength or stature, depends on their capacity to resist evil and their tenacity in the face of defeat. It was this quality that Tolkien witnessed among his comrades on the Western Front. In a 1964 BBC interview, Tolkien explains that, quote, I have always been impressed that we are here surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds. Tolkien explains with enthusiasm, the hobbits were a reflection of the English soldier, made small of stature to emphasize the amazing and unexpected heroism of ordinary men. Tolkien's emulation of this heroism he encountered during World War I makes his depiction of courage realistic and robust throughout his works. Tolkien also tends to shy away from detailed and intense descriptions of battle. Bilbo being knocked out unconscious in the Battle of the Five Armies, Frodo lost consciousness after being stabbed by the Morgul blade on Weathertop, and Pippin, blacked out, missed the last stand at the Black Gate only to wake up in time to hear the Eagles are coming. Boromir's heroic defiance of the orcs is detailed only in the aftermath of the arrows that pierced him. Likewise, Faramir's rearguard stand is seen from a distance by those watching on the walls in Minas Tirith. Tolkien uses his fairy story to share his contemplation of war while examining its virtues and weakness. This story depicts the war as he experienced it. Traditional values of honor, courage, and valor, which many wartime authors abandoned, are embraced by Tolkien. while also cautioning against pride, greed, and self-importance. Tolkien shows the reader many sides of the battle, which creates a more profound consideration of the merits of war. Tolkien saw the filth of trench life and felt firsthand the intensity of killing and dying. Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher about his realization that evil exists on both sides of the war. Quote, I think hopefully I'm not off on my slides. I can't see what number my slide is, so let me make sure. We're going to roll with it. So Tolkien saw the filth of trench life and firsthand felt the intensity of killing and dying. Tolkien wrote to his son Christopher about the realization that evil exists on both sides of the war. I think the orcs are, quote, I think the orcs are as real a creation as anything. Only in real life, men are on both sides. Tolkien wrote about his wartime exposure as gray days wasted in wearily going over and over and over again the dreary topics, the dull backwaters of the art of killing are not enjoyable. These are examples of Tolkien's dislike of war, specifically the aspects of violence towards others. To his oldest son, Michael, he laments the interruption of his formal education to fight in World War II, as his own education was interrupted by World War I. Tolkien writes to his son Christopher describing the horrific nature of war, the utter stupid waste of war, not only material but moral and spiritual, is so staggering to those who have to endure it. Again, Tolkien acknowledges the horrors of war, but he also comments on how war could affect those who endure it. Also, he does not directly address nonviolence, but it seems clear that Tolkien's views on war at least contain some disdain for the whole affair. In his archived correspondence, there are references to Tolkien's anti-war and anti-machine sentiments. In a letter to his son Christopher in 1945, he writes, well, the first war of the machines seemed to be drawing to its final inconclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant, the machines. He is horrified by the atomic bomb, stating the utter folly of these lunatic physicists to consent to do such work for such war purposes, calmly plotting the destruction of the world. Such explosives in man's hands, while their moral and intellectual status is declining.
Hey, Miriam, just a quick note. You're on the next slide now, so
okay.
If you just go one down. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you for that.
Cool.
Later in 1956, he writes, he, Frodo, is not in modern terms a pacifist, of course. He was mainly horrified at the prospect of civil war among hobbits. But he had, I suppose, also concluded that physical fighting is less ultimately effective than most good men think it. These letters shed additional light on his distaste for the unnecessary destruction of human life. He concedes that Frodo believed physical fighting was less effective than most think. Far from a glowing embrace of nonviolence, yet Tolkien at least wants the reader to consider if violent action is effective or necessary. If we look to the Lord of the Rings for answers around Tolkien's stance on nonviolence, there is no scarcity for consideration of the complexities of war. War is one of the major themes of Tolkien's legendarium. Faramir, who Tolkien himself has regarded as a character most like him, expresses the simple and realistic view that, quote, war must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. This statement, again, acknowledges that although war is not the preferred choice for conflict resolution, there are times that no other choices are available. Using fairy stories, Tolkien found a canvas perfectly fitted for painting the merits of sacrifice, mercy, courage, and pity. We can see clear examples of nonviolent engagement by looking directly at examples of these attributes throughout Tolkien's work. Courage is most profound in the small and ordinary characters who take on tasks of tremendous dangerousness and importance without hesitation or resistance. Courage is also found in confronting violence with nonviolence, as we see in many of Tolkien's characters. This includes Sam, who defies the darkest of monsters to protect Frodo, Faramir, who releases the ring from his grasp despite Gondor's needs, and both Frodo and Bilbo, who show courage by putting themselves in harm's way for the benefit of others. Pity is a powerful character attribute that influences the entire development of Middle-earth. Bilbo's encounter with Gollum in The Hobbit, and Bilbo processes reasons to strike and reasons not to strike, even in the face of violence. He is fearful and justified in striking out, but ultimately a, quote, sudden understanding turned Bilbo's sword. By deciding against striking Gollum, Bilbo shows mercy for him, even though Gollum had planned to harm him. We also see pity as Bilbo feels empathy about how life must be for Gollum, and courage as he leaps over the creature to avoid harming him. This example of using characters to explore essential themes shows how Tolkien moved beyond melancholy, anger, and frustration towards war to create an epic about war that tackled the complex topics of violent and nonviolent engagement. When Gollum later falls in with Frodo on his march to Mount Doom, the hobbits heed Gandalf's advice and even come to feel a sort of empathy for Gollum. Bilbo and Frodo's mercy towards the creature ultimately saves the day. Gollum's life was spared by Bilbo in the Misty Mountains, by Frodo in the Emyn Muil, by Faramir in Ithilien, and by Sam on the slopes of Mount Doom. Without this continued display of mercy and pity, Gollum may have been removed, and the ring might never have been destroyed. Sauron is undone by the mercy of others. Examples of sacrifice include Frodo, who makes the long journey to Mordor to play his part in winning the war. He was the savior and martyr for the Shire and all of Middle-earth. Similarly, the elves fought against Sauron and supported the ring's destruction, and in doing so, they lost their precious realms. With the failing power of the three rings, Rivendell and Lothlorien lost their splendor and magic and no longer provided a place for the elves to live freely. Throughout his works, Tolkien also generates ambivalence about the effectiveness of violence. Isildur's military defeat of Sauron is followed closely by his personal inability to destroy the ring. Sam questions the need for violence with the Haradrim falls through the trees to his death, just where Sam and Frodo are hiding. Sam looked at the fallen man and, quote, wondered what the man's name was and where he had come from, and if he was really evil at heart, or what lies or threats had led him on the long march from his home, and if he was really evil of heart. And from the long march of home, and if he would not rather have stayed there in peace. For Sam, the raiding Haradrim are not just other. He recognizes their common humanity and grieves that it has ended with the death of this soldier. Tolkien uses this example to personalize war and create a stronger consideration for striking out in violence, even when you perceive that something is evil. Tolkien shows the physical devastation of war frequently throughout his book. In The Fellowship of the Ring, Anduin is described by Treebird as the lands that once held the gardens of the Entwives and were alive and beautiful. Over 3,000 years ago, Sauron destroyed them during the War of the Last Alliance, and now they're a wasteland, brown, dried, and dead. The dead marshes are festering devastation, lingering for over 3,000 years with pools of fetid water and images of lost fighters, a literal view of the cost of war. Sauron's spreading domination brings about destruction, darkness, and wastelands in the realms he occupies. Sauron turns from the path to evil, treachery, and takes down the beautiful woods and surrounding area of Orthanc in the tower at the center of Isengard. Tolkien helps readers mourn the loss of the physical world, reminding us that it is not only persons who suffer during war. There are also warnings from those who engage in violence without just cause. Boromir is perhaps the best example in The Lord of the Rings, as he is driven to madness by his desire to obtain the ring, which would please his father, and use the ring to destroy others while defending his people. The wars waged against Morgoth provide many terrors of war, and the once free elves of the West are drawn deeper and deeper into darkness as they fight against him. The battle of unnumbered tears and the tragedy of Turin provides adequate warnings about the risk of glorifying war and fighting for unjust causes. While these stated ambivalences do not represent Tolkien rejection of violence outright, many nonviolent values and critiques of war are present. In The Lord of the Rings, again and again, we see the countercurrents resisting the tides of war, an understanding that violence alone cannot defeat Sauron and his evil. Although the story's heroes achieve some significant military victories, these are only prolonging the inevitable. If the ring remains intact, it will resurface, leaving the evil to be managed later. To refuse the path of warfare, to seek non-confrontation, is unthinkable to Tolkien's villain Sauron, who knows only a deep desire for power and thus cannot even consider the path of peaceful resistance that Frodo and Sam take. Ultimately, the hidden and quiet quest of Frodo and Sam to destroy the ring bring about the vanquishing of evil. Throughout the ring's progress from the Shire to its eventual destruction in the fires of Mount Doom, numerous individuals are tested with the offer to use the ring of power in battle to face the enemy with his own weapon. This choice lies between the willingness to dominate and accept one's place in a larger community, take the place of the one, or defend the needs of many. Aragorn willingly puts his life and the lives of his troop at risk for the greater good. Quote, "We must take ourselves for bait. We must walk open-eyed into that trap, with courage but small hope for ourselves. For my lords, it may well prove that we ourselves shall perish utterly in a black battle far from this living land, so that even if Barad-dûr be thrown down, we shall not live to see a new age. But this, I deem, is our duty." His act is not merely one of aggression or physical contest. It is a sacrifice to gain and hold the attention of an enemy without hope of any military success. However, the primary driver of Tolkien's heroes is not personal glory or renown, but international stability, the prevention of future conflicts, and lasting peace. A close reading of The Lord of the Rings in search of nonviolent countercurrents is perhaps the most convincing evidence to support the argument that Tolkien embeds these ideas of nonviolent themes and techniques in his works. Tolkien understood the unhappy balance between the occasional necessity for war on one hand, and on the other, the price it exacts from the bodies and souls of its participants. Even if Tolkien rejected nonviolence as a universal ethic, he created a respectful space for its consideration in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien understood the doomed balance between the necessity for war and the costs it takes from humans and nature. He was a thoughtful observer of war, and the detail and care Tolkien took with his depiction of conflict encouraged the reader to look behind the war and consider things that are most important. He creates a guide for those virtues of courage, pity, mercy, and sacrifice that should be emulated. If we use Tolkien's work to define his thoughts on war, Tolkien believes some wars must be fought. Yet we can also see clearly that Tolkien found virtue in nonviolent actions. Tolkien warns against the lust for power and the will to dominate others throughout his works. He also emphasizes leadership, community, and honor, which remain a part of nonviolent philosophies and account for the countercurrents of nonviolence themes present in his works. Understanding Tolkien's views on war not only sheds light on his convictions surrounding violent engagement, but also aids the reader towards a deeply meaningful and powerful understanding of his works. It is here I begin to understand how Tolkien's epic of war guided me to consider the moral dilemmas surrounding war and violent confrontation from a variety of different angles. By expanding my understanding of the complexities of war, I begin to see the tenuous balance between pacifism and militarism. The care Tolkien takes showing how one moves from violent engagement to one of peace may account for my connection to this topic. Before my exposure to The Lord of the Rings, my viewpoint was narrow, and I did not believe violence could have any merits. Although I still cannot imagine engaging in or encouraging violence to solve conflicts, I have a more comprehensive viewpoint considering that the necessities of war at times. Faramir describes Tolkien's careful consideration of this impasse beautifully. War must be while we defend our lives against the destroyer who would devour us all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. Right.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Miriam. Thank you for that, presenting that. That's a great start to get our conversation going. If you want to unshare the screen, yeah, there we go. And I love that you created for us a book-ended personal conversation that allows us to read closely with consequence in our own rereading of Lord of the Rings and the Legendarium and Tolkien's work. So I want to so for you, so I just want to go through a few thoughts and then we'll come to some questions. So for you, you didn't grow up with the Lord of the Rings as a child, so you encountered it as an adult, is that right?
Yeah, I guess I was probably in my high school years.
Yeah. So you were already a pacifist when you read this, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I was already an advocate of nonviolent intervention, and yeah.
Did you feel that when you knew you were loving the Lord of the Rings, did you feel you had to get a razor blade and take a bumper sticker off your car? Did you feel that crisis when you're young, or is that something that's deepened as you went?
No, I actually didn't notice it until I was older. I mean, it's part of why I wrote this paper, is because, as I said, I sort of always just chalked him up as somebody who you would include in conversations about how to manage aggression and things like that in a positive way. But as I became more aware of really what the story, and I think actually when the movies came out is when I first was like, oh my gosh, there's so much just violence. And so that's the thing that made me sort of say, well, why have you always, that's always been there. Why didn't you see that? And so I'm what I think sort of happened is I just was connecting to the pieces that I really loved about the story, the honor and the courage and the sacrifice, and then sort of not really seeing the other side of it. And so taking a look at both was helpful.
Yeah. When the Lord of the Rings came out, I discovered how much running there was, how much in that middle book, or how much walking there was in the books, which you kind of, because they're talking and there's poems and that landscape, so you don't really think of it the same way. But yeah, do you think, I wonder, is there when we're reading fantasy, science fiction, the historical stuff, do we kind of are we sort of separating ourselves a bit as we encounter violence, so that that's a thing that happens in books and I'm somebody that sits in my real world? Is that distancing something we do?
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe that's a piece of it. As you grow older, you become more alert to some of the horrible things that are happening. Sometimes, I think today's, thinking about all the violence that is happening currently, it becomes more on the forefront, and it's harder to just see it from, that outside view.
Yeah, no, and actually it's funny, you're doing that presentation on countercurrents in an epic of war, and it's been ever present in my mind, but Eastern Europe, the Russian attack and occupation of the Ukraine, that's I didn't immediately draw that in, and I'm a pretty culturally connected writer. I wonder what sort of little foxholes we create in our mind to separate ourselves, from certain kinds of connections, right?
Right.
Yeah, maybe protect ourselves a little bit, right? So, yeah, or just justify it. There's a lot of violence and some texts, and it's not all redemptive or supportive or satirical or anything like that, right?
Right.
Yeah. Is it different on the screen, when Peter Jackson takes this epic and visualizes it and gives it motion like that? Does that change our relationship as people with in a culture with a history of violence, and where that issue could continually come up? Is that a harder thing, a problematic thing? What do you see there?
Yeah, I think so. seeing again, like I mentioned, I think the movies are sort of what triggered me to like be like, whoa, so much violence. And then and so part of my question was, is this interpretation of the works accurate? I mean, and that's part of what led me to Signum, was like looking around and thinking more about, his works, and then how it's being depicted is very different. And I hadn't studied his works as like a, in a scholarly way or something like that. And so this sort of work has been, interesting to really look closely at what's actually doing. A close reading is probably one of the things that I learned most throughout the master's program, is how important that is to do close readings and really see what's being said. And so
Yeah, no, that's right.
yeah,
And
but I do think that the visual depiction of works can be very impactful. It's very hard for me to now read the books without thinking of all of the characters that Peter Jackson created, and sort of in my head. So I think
yeah,
there's good things and bad things, but
they do weave into us, particularly visual. I find it even like if I end up listening to like an audiobook, like I'll see the film as well as the text kind of as I'm reading. It's very immersive for me. The Peter Jackson Hobbit interpretations, you noted that the text sort of winks away at some points of war, right? The actual conflict, and yet that third Peter Jackson Hobbit film is like all the stuff that happens while Bilbo's knocked out, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Or a third of that film, you know, Bilbo should have been asleep for, right? Or knocked out for, right? Yeah. Like in your paper, do you then like that winking away effect where we come to the moment and then pull away a bit? Like even in like the Battle of Helm's Deep, which I think is the most detailed battle scene in the trilogy, the 6 books of Lord of the Rings. But even then, there's not a lot of actual detail of the hand-to-hand combat, right? It's actually the stuff that's happening and moving around, but we hear the count of the body count between Legolas and Gimli, but we don't see it happen in the same way that we do on film. Is that winking away? Is that part of your analysis? Like, do you think that Tolkien is pulling us back a bit from that? Is that what you were trying to say at that point?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to think about, when considering how much care he took when depicting war and what that meant. I do think that it's interesting. I never connected that before, but when sort of looking at how he really describes war, you can see some of the distance he puts in it, and then knowing more about his experience and finding some of that out, it's interesting to try to think about, is this part of, is Tolkien protecting us from the horrible things that he had to deal with, or is he encouraging, he knows he needs to have battles in there, but he doesn't really want to write about it because or something like that. So trying to think about why the depiction is the way it is.
Yeah, I want to come back at the end just to the complexities of what you presented on that personal level, but in terms of like approach to the thesis, like was this kind of in your mind, this question in your mind, like when you signed up for Signum ever and anon ago, like the 10 courses in a thesis ago or whatever, 8 courses in a thesis ago?
No, I mean, maybe, I from the very beginning, they talk about, well, you got to start thinking about like what you might want to look at. And in other classes, I had written some about the violence and things like that. And so it was something that's been a theme of mine. And I really enjoyed the idea of trying to figure out how to put the personal piece, my own sort of like transformation or something inside of the paper there. So, yeah.
No, excellent. I think it did cook in you or no, that's not the right word. It did grow inside of you for quite some time. Like, are you naturally, I mean, not everybody signs up for an entire master's degree program because they're curious about a particular question, right? Or even because they're transformed by a particular body of work or writing. Uh, like, are you naturally inclined to like academic writing? Like, is that something that you're drawn to?
No, no, but I love reading and I love writing, and I have a very busy life, and I also I always found that I was like putting it off or not really doing it. And so when I found out about Signum, and I just said, well, I got, you got to like push yourself to sort of do something like that. So it was mostly a challenge for myself to like get more engaged and start to figure out how to read and write in a better way. And so it was mostly just to expand. And then I actually didn't really realize that you could like audit the classes, or something. And so I think as I got like, 3 or 4 classes in, I was like, why didn't I just like audit it? But it really, what I needed to happen was to say, you have a deadline and you have to turn this in and you're getting a grade. And so that was part of what pushed me to do that. So
Yeah, no, I get it. It is true. Like, we have a pretty great like audit program, right? The discussion audit, or just attend the lectures. When it comes to me, I need at least the weekly discussions, just so that I know that I'm like doing the reading and prepared and stuff. Like, I need that. Like, it doesn't matter how much I love the books, I need that kind of tease forward, I think, accountability or something. So for me anyway. Yeah.
right.
So we got a few different kind of comments here, and some intriguing thoughts. And so let me just kind of start to present them to you. Some comments, like, Penn says, I love the countercurrents idea, and that does work, I think, well, right? Kate Neville says, like, the one invented part, like an invention that Kate actually liked within the Peter Jackson interpretations, was Bilbo using Sting before he met Gollum. And so this gave his choice not to strike Gollum some extra impact. Do you see what the force of that is? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. And then Janet Croft notes, in the Hobbit, of course, the battles told in retrospect, it's a children's book. Do you think like that switch from like the move from the Hobbit to, and I haven't read the first edition of the Hobbit, like thinking of this question at all, but like the move from the Hobbit, definitely a children's book, though open to adults, to something that's often encountered by children, but certainly written as an adult book. Did that change that kind of immersion into the possibility of violence and the realities of that? In the
I mean, I think that obviously the Hobbit, the progression to the Lord of the Rings and his expansion on describing really intense things that are happening and dangerous things and violent things definitely takes place. So it expands a lot in the Lord of the Rings, and I think I think mainly because he was getting into the story, and really finding what he wanted to be writing about, and that I think that's part of where he began to, like, some of the stuff he had dealt with throughout the war was starting to come out into his writing, and we see that those were the things that I was looking for. So
yeah, and it is nice that we have some historical resources, people talking about this, like Tolkien and his environment, his thoughts, his ideas. So there are some resources for that. I have almost question, but I'm actually going to pull back from that. I'm actually going to ask you something here that Liz says, which is kind of interesting, and maybe from your psychiatric nurse perspective, or that particular hat, like whether you interpret that differently. Liz asks, have you seen any evidence of empathy, like other than mercy or pity as specific characters, but empathy in the Hobbit's behavior in the Lord of the Rings, I believe here?
I'm trying to think about the difference between empathy and pity.
Yeah. I mean, pity you work through as a central theme, and I think that comes out in your text. It also comes out, I think, even in the adaptations. That's when mercy a little less in the adaptation I've seen.
Yeah.
Empathy, that what is that? I guess feeling with or walking with emotionally or something. Would that be the way you would want to define that? Or
yeah, I mean, I guess the most, I think the hobbits are the most empathetic beings in the story. It feels like, because they, they are leaving this sort of safe haven of, this amazing place to help the rest of the world that they didn't even really know existed, until they get out there, but they're, they don't withdraw. They get more and more involved and invested and willing to be a part of what needed to be done. And I think that shows quite a bit of empathy towards just what everybody else has been dealing with around, the terror and violence of that. So
yeah, and I wonder, to flip that question just a little bit, if Tolkien, whether instinctively or intentionally, uses the hobbits to create empathy with us as the readers. I mean, we really walk with them in a way we don't walk with any of the heroic humans or other characters, right? So, right, we like, or at least I do. I don't know. Like, I'm not a walk with characters reader, but I am with the Lord of the Rings. I find myself wanting to be sort of Frodo-like or Sam-like. Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
So it draws us into that experience. We have a question from Kate. It's an intriguing question, but I don't want to say, like, you could totally say no to this one. Do you know Perillandra? Do you know C.S. Lewis's?
It was one of the books that we read, I think, actually in your class. So
okay, yeah.
And I'm looking at the question here.
All right, yeah.
So, you can read it or what, but
well, yeah, no, I will read it because you and I have privilege to things that nobody else can see. But Kate asks, have you looked at the moment in Perillandra where Ransom, who's I don't know, this sort of like philologist, academic turned interstellar superhero turned divine mystic throughout the series or something. Anyway, at some point he has to choose whether or not to use physical violence to fight, once it's clear that arguments have become sort of tangible and physical in the discussion. So it's breaking. There's like a demonic character who's breaking down this innocent, unfallen character, and that when that breakdown starts to happen physically, then Ransom has the idea and throws it away and comes back to it about whether or not physical violence will be needed, and then chooses that path. And Kate asked the question about, like, thinking of that scene, would there have been some sort of inkling conversation about the kind of question you're asking, is when does violence become a necessity of some kind, right?
I'm mostly intrigued. I know she at the end just said, I wonder if this was an ongoing inkling conversation. In that piece of it is something I wish I could have written more about maybe how his writing and his works were influenced by those that were helping him as he was writing. That was one piece that I didn't really get to look at, if there was some influence there. But it isn't and I read Perillandra just once a couple of years ago, I think. So I don't know that one very well, but it does seem like it's something that would be connected.
Yeah, it's one I struggle. It's a moment I struggle with myself moving back and forth and seeing the necessity of, and then feeling sort of defeated in reading, and then I come back and I've just never been reconciled to it. But that final moment with a Gollum sort of takes that question out of, like, Frodo's control in a certain kind of sense, right? Like, Frodo has fallen and may do violence, but the moment moves past him. Is that right? Like, the choice is taken away from him in a certain kind of way, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like Tolkien protecting Frodo, or Yeah, it's a
Right.
curious one for me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And at least, and then one of the other hobbits becomes a hero, like um critical in a moment of defeating, maybe symbolically defeating death, I think, right? In the way that works. um yeah, but and then it's almost destroys him too, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
these moments of ambivalence. Penn writes, violence alone cannot defeat Sauron, and thought that was very profound. Can you articulate or elaborate some of the things or characteristics, actions that are needed to defeat Sauron that aren't are not violent themselves, right? And I think actually, that's a good question to kind of clarify. I think what is central to what you were saying in the introduction, um, um, but I think we ended up going mentally to the different examples of courage, pity, ambivalence, that kind of thing. So what's the big nonviolent action that is needed to defeat Sauron?
Yeah, well, I spoke a little, I guess it's hard to say which was most important. But the big thing of sparing Gollum, so the mercy sort of put towards this creature that on a number of occasions could have very easily been destroyed or taken out of the plot because of the things he did or the way he was acting, and the mercy that he was shown, from the mercy that he was shown throughout the story ended up ultimately. So Gollum is the reason why the ring gets destroyed in the end, and so if he had been destroyed, we may not have seen that occur. So I think that's probably the big one. I would guess, just sort of winging it, but I do think that just the perseverance, the courage, the willingness of the hobbits to just trudge forward and do what they could to try to to make it happen. So
Yeah. And there's that moment, I think it's in your, I don't know if this was in the final bit of your thesis or just in our discussions, that let folly be our cloak. Like the whole, oh no, it's definitely in your thesis. The main thrust is itself an unviolence, right? The destruction of the ring is it's a pulling, I can't remember the words that you use, but like an active nonviolent
right.
piece, right? Yeah.
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 Is and to me shows the cast of Sauron's mind so bent on a particular mode of relation to the world, the violence, that can't even imagine the idea of choosing another pathway, like leaving power, leaving violence, that sort of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, that's right. And Liz actually asked an intriguing question here, particularly when you think of like the War of the Ring being one of the history, one of the books of Middle Earth history, and Tolkien, I think, referencing, if I recall, Lord of the Rings kind of as the War of the Ring, or the War of Sauron, that kind of thing. So there's that's certainly the thing that's going on, and Sauron is making war, right? The war is upon us, right? So there's that reality. Liz asks, is that, like, I've always thought of the wars in the background. So is war plot A or plot B of the Lord of the Rings? Because I mean, it's not plot A, certainly of The Hobbit, for example, right? So is it plot A or plot B?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have just seen, I've always seen it as plot A, that it was like at the forefront and the driving piece behind all of the other things that are going on. So yeah, that's been my impression of it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's more of a recent, like, it's hard for me to think because I've been so focused on that for like 3 years or whatever, that it's hard for me to maybe think back when I first read the book about whether that stood out. And I guess I said I was more focused on the nonviolent stuff that was happening and didn't even really see the violent stuff. So maybe it is, maybe that's part of his skill. I mean, I think that's one of the amazing things that Tolkien was able to do, was to depict this war in a way that, you know, we see it from so many different angles and experience it in different ways.
Yeah, and maybe plot A, plot B is the wrong two sets of things. Maybe it should be more like background, foreground, like a painting, or like impression, like within a visual piece, right? Or the architectural structure, right? You see, there could be other ways of thinking about it, but there's some comments here about Bill in the chat, just about Bilbo, or sorry, Frodo and the scouring of the Shire, and is it mercy? Is it justice? Not killing Sauron, or not, you know, ideally not killing Sauron. So like that's, and I think Frodo's statement, you know, limit the violence as much as possible, to draw as little blood as possible, right? That's the ethos. And I don't know that he actually raises a sword in that, in the counter the scouring of the Shire response, though he is a general in that sense, right? That it does seem like the book takes that ambivalence and puts it into that whole scene, that whole character moment, right? Of Frodo, in a sense, winning this battle against a great magician and his right-hand man without drawing a sword or a bow, right? It's an intriguing, an intriguing kind of a thing. So I don't know, man. I love the plot A, plot B thing, but now that I all of a sudden I wanted to pull back from that. There's a couple comments too about like going out from the Lord of the Rings, and this kind of terrifies me just a little bit, because there was so much to read in your paper. There's stuff you didn't get to spend time close reading, and like a question like, you know, Galadriel in Silmarillion, and then like and her history, and then which includes a great violence, and then the way that she welcomes the Wayfarers and engages in this final war with Sauron, right? Like there's all those sorts of things, but that would just be bigger. Like I don't know how to put it. It's just too much, right? Is there anything else that, like, is there something that you left out, was one of the questions here. Sarah Brown, Sarah asks, what did you want to include but had to cut for space or focus, right?
Yeah, well, for the presentation, I had to cut a part of the paper out about allegory, and really looking at you know, whether his representation of war was allegorical or not, and that to me was a really interesting thing, but my presentation already felt too long, so I cut that piece out. And I think one of the things that are like Brenton's saying, I wasn't able to look at multiple works, you know, it was like overwhelming to just do the Lord of the Rings, you know, and so I would have been really curious to look more at some of his other writings and see if there were themes throughout each of the writings and similarities that would help maybe to make it more clear that part of what he's doing is representing something in a certain way in many different stories, or is it different? And because I was really curious about what his own belief was. For whatever reason, it was important for me to like try to understand what Tolkien thought about war, and like what would he say to somebody about, should you engage violently with somebody? And then as we worked on the paper, we sort of came to a realization that that wasn't really important. It was more important to understand, like, as a reader, you know, what's your experience of it? And so having to shift a bit away from, you know, it's not really important what Tolkien believed, although for me it was like, you know, because I want to like put him up on this sort of pedestal again with like Martin Luther King, or, you know, things like that. So
yeah. You want to put the Frodo Lives sticker next to the Make Peace Not War sticker, right, on the bumper sticker on the back of the car. And Tolkien does invite that, like, give us the story in that sense. As you noted in the paper, there is a giving over to us as the reader for that kind of question, for that kind of engagement, right? And I don't think that we can, it's kind of asking the wrong question, was Tolkien a pacifist? Like, unless he has like dealt with the question in the way that we're asking it, it's really, we're asking him us to make a decision about him that wasn't before him, in a sense, right? Like the spectrum of is it militarism to pacifism that you kind of presented with the different acts of nonviolence within that spectrum, right? He would need to know what we know to answer the question the way that we're wanting to be satisfied. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so.
So the we want to wrap up here. There's some notes of congratulations here, including Janet Croft. Janet Brennan Croft would have been one of the sources that you've read.
I know. I sort of wish she was still here, because I like when I saw her name right before we started, and I was like, oh my God, like
yeah.
Because she definitely, her book, she wrote a book about war and the works of Tolkien, and I used her research a lot.
Yeah, that's right.
Very helpful and clear.
And one of the few monographs on that, also she edited a collection about Tolkien in the war context, right? And so some folks have asked about character connections. I'll combine sort of two questions. The character that you related to most in the book is one question, and then, but making it more intense, Bethany asks, what most personifies you? Is there a character that would personify you? Oh no, actually, this is really intriguing. There's your personal connection to a character. I misread the question. And is there a character within the series that personifies what you would interpret to be Tolkien's personal or private view of war?
Yeah.
See the two.
Yeah, and there are, I'm not the first person to say this, and I think I mentioned in my paper that people have said, and I think even Tolkien may have said, that Faramir was a character that probably most closely represented Tolkien, not just his views on war, but also just his, his thoughtfulness and sort of the way he goes about things. So I guess I would say Faramir and his willing to be careful and considerate and thoughtful and wise. Yeah,
intriguing. Is that the character that you resonate most with in the Lord of the Rings itself?
Maybe, yes. He's definitely one of my favorites. Like Gandalf is also one that I think probably more frequently I've found that I agree with and maybe connect the most with and most curious about, because he's he's powerful, but it's almost like Aslan or something, a little bit like has this power, is he safe? No, but he's good.
there is an almost divine quality to his engagement. He's there, he's not there. He has to make choices that he doesn't explain. And but also like he's the one that cooks up the plan to destroy the ring, right? To pull that power out of the question rather than to wield it, right? So which would be huge. Okay, so just to kind of bring this to close, Kate's actually noting Tom Hillman has a coming book on pity in the Legendarium, and I don't know where that's at either, but thanks for that note, Kate, because I've seen Tom talking about that in social media. That'd be something to watch, and there could be a great kind of connection there. I want to bring this kind of back personally. Like, were you like, you've got the crisis, you've got the thing, the value of the nonviolence, and then you've got the the Lord of the Rings. Both are building you through life and find their way in different ways. Was there never like a temptation just to kind of like, oh no, this is really like a pacifist book, right? And here's why people are misreading it totally. Like, was there ever, because you come in the middle and you say that there's currents and countercurrents of violence and nonviolence, and to miss the nonviolence is to misread the book, right? So was there ever a temptation though to like let your heart kind of move over towards that
right.
Less nuanced reading?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I came into it understanding that I was, I had this sort of naive belief about, how much it might support or, preach pacifism. But I guess what I wasn't prepared for, and the thing that sort of happened as I did the research, was that I was not prepared for myself to sort of shift a little bit in my own views, right? I mean, I was prepared for the idea that Tolkien probably had views that were not pacifist, obviously, and to sort of encounter that. But what I wasn't prepared for is, as I went through that, sort of feeling almost convinced or something like that, that part of what Tolkien allowed me to do was to identify that my view of like pacifism always is the way to go isn't something that that I think, after sort of looking at all of this, is that I don't think it's realistic. I think that there are times when violence has to occur, and I guess the thing I'm hopeful about, that we learn about, is that there are really careful things to do before you engage in violence, and then also a consideration of what, if there is something violent that has to happen, how that occurs, and
Right.
the care that you take around that if you can. So I that was the piece that was, I think, sort of surprising for me as I wrote this, is that I felt my own views sort of shifting a little bit when they had been so concrete before. So
Yeah. No,
and mostly, and not just Tolkien, but being exposed to a lot of the literature that we're exposed to in the program, helps me to see some of the writings about when violence was more commonly done, and some of the honor around engaging in honorable violence, that sort of stuff has helped me to see it in a different way. So
yeah, and I watched you shift over the months that you were
yeah,
looking at.
right.
It was actually relatively early, but in that first few months, I watched that kind of shift, and you've come to this kind of new conclusion. But it must be particularly complex, given your personal context, not merely as a mental health care worker, or specifically a psychiatric nurse, but also within the correction system, where the results and the living realities of violence would be such a part of the work that you do, right? I mean, it has an imprint that's not heroic in most of the cases you encounter. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's true, that in addition to like the research that I did that helped me to grow, I think also in my life, just being exposed to my work and what I do, and being around in a correctional setting where there's lots of violence, or violence that has occurred, or we're talking about violence, and sort of understanding more about where that comes from, and how it happens, and some of those things. So it certainly is something that's close to my heart.
Yeah, and I think as a culture, I think we need to be intelligent and creative and productive in the way that we respond, so that we don't sort of perpetuate violence, in the system of restriction and healing and community development that we want to create, right? So
Right.
that note that you made of, like, it's not just whether or not to do something violent, right, but like how one does it, right? The character of that is really
Right.
critical.
Yeah, if it has to come to that, which hopefully it doesn't, there are things that I feel like can be done to make it as honorable as it can be, if there's such a thing. So
Excellent. All right. Well, I think there's a couple more questions, but we're going to have to leave them for today. I want to thank you, Miriam, and thank the audience. Feel free to put comments in the chat there, folks, just to pass on to Miriam. Thank you, Miriam, for your thoughtful paper. I just loved seeing this process all the way through. I got the idea from the pitch, and then I watched you have to fight with it. This was not an easy, like, I'll just whip off a weekend paper kind of thing. This was a year of work from our first conversation to now. And so I love being part of it. I want to congratulate you on finishing this and your Master's of Arts at Signum University.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your support, and thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, folks. This will be up on the website, on Signum University's YouTube channel. And I hope you look forward to future projects we have, not just on Tolkien, but on a whole array of engagement with imaginative literature, Germanic philology, and all kinds of projects. And feel free to reach out to us with ideas or questions. And we hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.